music. There exists in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest a delicate boundary, an invisible line between the mapped world of human civilization and territories still governed by ancient rhythms and unseen inhabitants. For generations, stories have persisted of encounters along this threshold, whispered accounts of hikers, hunters, and wanderers who glimpsed something extraordinary in the shadows between towering conifers. Most such tales dissolve under scrutiny, attributed to misidentification, imagination, or deliberate fabrication. But occasionally, an encounter emerges that defies conventional explanation, a moment when the boundary between worlds temporarily dissolves, leaving those who experience it forever changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For Megan Collins, a 32-year-old ultra-marathon runner from Seattle, that moment came on an unseasonably warm April morning in 2023, along a remote section of the Cascade Range. An experienced athlete with multiple 100-mile races, to her credit, Megan approached the wilderness with reverence rather than conquest in mind. The forest was her sanctuary, a place where the rhythm of her footfalls and breathing could synchronize with something larger and more ancient than the urban cacophony of her everyday existence. The trails were my therapy, Megan would later explain, her eyes distant as she recalled her life before the encounter. Whenever things got too chaotic, I'd lace up and disappear into the green. It wasn't about the miles or elevation gain. It was about reconnecting with something essential that modern life tries to strip away. This philosophy had served her well through a career as an environmental lawyer and recovery from a painful divorce 3 years earlier. The mountains had witnessed her tears, her rage, her eventual healing. They had become more than a training ground. They were confidants of a sort, keepers of her vulnerabilities and triumphs alike. It was this deep familiarity with the Cascades that made Megan's experience all the more profound. She knew these mountains, their moods, their secrets, their seasonal transformations, or so she believed. On that fateful April morning, Megan set out before dawn from a remote trailhead near the North Cascades National Park boundary. Her plan was ambitious, but well within her capabilities. A 40-mile loop traversing both established trails and some cross-country sections, summiting 2 minor peaks before returning to her parked Subaru by nightfall. She carried the essential gear of an experienced alpinist: layered clothing, navigation tools, emergency supplies, adequate nutrition, and 2 liters of water she would replenish at streams along the route. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The early hours passed in meditative bliss. As dawn broke over the eastern ridges, golden light filtered through old-growth canopy, illuminating gaps in the forest where spring wildflowers had begun their annual emergence. Megan maintained a comfortable pace, her body finding that efficient rhythm that could be sustained for hours without deterioration. By mid-morning, she had covered nearly 15 miles, ascending the first summit on her itinerary and pausing briefly to absorb panoramic views of snow-capped peaks extending toward the horizon like frozen waves. It was during her descent into the valley between peaks that Megan first sensed something amiss. The forest, normally vibrant with birdsong and small animal movements, had fallen unnaturally silent. The air seemed to thicken, charged with an almost electrical tension that raised goosebumps along her exposed arms, despite the warming temperature. It was like that moment before a thunderstorm breaks, she would later describe. That pressure change you can feel in your sinuses and chest, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Trained to trust her instincts in the wilderness, Megan paused, scanning her surroundings with heightened awareness. The trail ahead descended through increasingly dense forest, where sunlight penetrated only in dappled patches. Nothing visible justified her sudden unease, yet she couldn't shake the visceral feeling of being observed. After a cautious minute, she continued forward, but her previously meditative state had vanished. Now, hyper-aware, she found herself continuously glancing over her shoulder, her pace unconsciously quickening. The pleasant fatigue of exertion was replaced by the tense alertness of prey, sensing a predator's proximity. 3 miles further along the trail, Megan rounded a blind corner and froze mid-stride. There, approximately 70 yards ahead where the path crossed a small alpine meadow, lay a fallen tree of massive proportions, a natural obstacle common enough in these forests. What caused her heart to stutter wasn't the tree itself, but what was happening around it. 3 figures moved with deliberate purpose around the fallen giant. Even at this distance, their immense size was immediately apparent. Standing fully, upright on 2 legs, they appeared to be working in coordinated fashion, stripping branches from the trunk with powerful, efficient movements. Their bodies were covered in dark hair, ranging from deep russet to coal black, and their proportions, while broadly humanoid, suggested strength far exceeding human capacity. Megan's mind cycled rapidly through possible explanations. Bears, engaged in some strange behavior. No, these beings moved bipedally with evident comfort, their gait and posture unmistakably hominid despite their massive frames. Other hikers in costume. The remote location and fluid natural movements rendered this explanation equally implausible. For several frozen heartbeats, she found herself unable to process what her eyes were witnessing. Then, with a crash that seemed to physically reverberate through her body, understanding crystallized, she was observing a family group of what Pacific Northwest folklore called Sasquatch or Bigfoot, beings whose existence science rejected, but indigenous traditions had acknowledged for centuries. This realization coincided with a sudden shift in the group's behavior. The largest figure, standing at what Megan estimated to be over 8 feet tall, abruptly ceased its activity and turned toward her position. Though separated by considerable distance, there was no doubt in Megan's mind that it had detected her presence, whether through sound, scent, or some other sense she couldn't determine. What followed was a moment of cross-species recognition that would fundamentally alter Megan's understanding of her place in the natural world. The creature stared directly at her with eyes that reflected not mere animal awareness, but unmistakable intelligence, a consciousness assessing her with evident calculation. Megan knew instinctively that flight would be futile. If these beings wished to pursue her, their evident strength and presumed familiarity with the terrain would make escape impossible. Instead, she remained motionless, controlling her breathing while maintaining eye contact with the massive figure. The alpha of the group, she presumed. After what seemed an eternity but was likely less than a minute, the alpha made a gesture, a deliberate movement of one massive arm that somehow communicated to the others without being overtly human in execution. The smaller figures, though still substantially larger than any human Megan had encountered, immediately ceased their activity and retreated toward the forest edge with remarkable silence for beings of such size. The alpha maintained its evaluative gaze for several more seconds before following its companions, disappearing into the dense undergrowth with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a creature of such mass. Within moments, the only evidence of their presence was the freshly stripped fallen tree and the thundering of Megan's pulse in her ears. When her faculties returned sufficiently to consider documentation, Megan realized her phone remained in her backpack's side pocket. The encounter had transpired too quickly, too unexpectedly for her to capture photographic evidence. All that remained was her testimony and the indelible impression seared into her consciousness. The intelligence in that gaze, the sophisticated, Coordination of the group, the deliberate nature of their communication. Common sense suggested immediate retreat, returning to her vehicle and the safety of human civilization. Yet something deeper, more primal in Megan's nature responded to what she had witnessed, not with fear alone, but with profound curiosity. These beings had demonstrated not hostility, but wariness, not aggression, but calculated assessment. They had withdrawn rather than confronted, despite their overwhelming physical advantage, making what some would later call a reckless decision, others an act of extraordinary courage. Megan chose to continue her planned route. This choice wasn't made lightly. She considered the risks with the careful analytical skills that had served her legal career. The beings had demonstrated awareness of her presence and had chosen disengagement. This suggested they were not actively territorial or aggressive toward humans who maintained appropriate distance. I felt like I'd been granted a glimpse of something few humans ever witness, she would later explain. Walking away immediately seemed almost disrespectful, like declining a rare gift or invitation. With heightened awareness, Megan proceeded along the trail, her senses attuned to the forest in ways they had never been before. The encounter had awakened something ancestral in her perception. The forest was no longer merely scenic backdrop for her athletic pursuits, but a living matrix of intelligences, some of which existed beyond conventional human acknowledgement. For several miles, nothing unusual occurred. Birdsong gradually returned to the canopy, and small mammals resumed their activities in the underbrush. Megan began to wonder if perhaps the encounter had been more momentary than she initially perceived, a brief intersection of paths rather than the beginning of a more complex interaction. This assessment proved premature. As afternoon shadows lengthened and Megan began ascending the second peak on her itinerary, evidence mounted that she was not moving through the forest unobserved. Subtle indicators, branches freshly broken at heights no human could reach, distinctive disturbances in moss-covered ground beyond the trail, momentary glimpses of movement, always just at the periphery of clear vision, suggested parallel travel. Something was keeping pace with her, maintaining distance while tracking her progress. Rather than panic, Megan found herself settling into an extraordinary awareness, a state of heightened presence she had never experienced even in her most focused athletic performances. It was as though the veil between ordinary consciousness and something more expansive had grown temporarily translucent. She perceived the forest not just visually, but through a synthesis of senses that noted patterns and relationships typically filtered from human awareness. It was like suddenly seeing the matrix code behind reality, she would attempt to explain months later. Everything connected, communicating in languages I couldn't quite grasp, but could somehow sense were being spoken all around me. As Megan reached the summit of the second peak, a rocky outcrop offering commanding views of the surrounding wilderness, she experienced a moment of clarity about her situation. She was being permitted to travel through territory that belonged to beings who could have easily prevented her passage. Their observation wasn't predatory, but evaluative, perhaps even protective in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. Seating herself on a sun-warmed boulder, Megan extracted her lunch from her pack, a simple meal of dried fruits, nuts, and jerky. Acting on intuition rather than conscious plan, she placed a small portion of her food on a separate rock several feet away from her position. An offering of sorts, though to whom or what she wasn't entirely certain. As she ate, Megan became aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The air seemed to thicken once again, with that distinctive tension she had felt before the initial encounter. Without making sudden movements, she scanned the tree line approximately 50 yards below the summit, where dense forest resumed after the alpine meadow. It took several moments for her eyes to resolve what they were seeing. So perfectly did the figures blend with the textured patterns of bark, shadow, and foliage. 4 distinct forms stood in a loose semicircle at the forest edge, the 3 individuals she had observed earlier, plus a 4th, slightly smaller than the others, but still massively proportioned compared to a human frame. Unlike before, they made no pretense of invisibility now. They stood upright, massive and undeniable, against the backdrop of ancient conifers, watching her with evident intention. The message was unmistakable. They wanted her to know they were there, that this was a deliberate revelation, rather than accidental exposure. For 20 breathless minutes, this extraordinary standoff continued, a human woman seated alone on an exposed summit, observed by creatures whose existence most of her species denied. No aggression manifested, no threatening displays occurred. Instead, there existed a palpable sense of mutual assessment, as if 2 intelligent species were taking measure of one another across an evolutionary divide. Then, with the sun beginning its westward descent toward the Pacific, Megan knew she needed to complete her journey before darkness claimed the forest. With deliberate movements, she repacked her supplies, leaving the food offering untouched on its stone altar. As she shouldered her pack and prepared to descend the opposite side of the peak toward the final leg of her loop, she turned once more toward the forest edge. The figures remained, watching with that same unsettling intelligence, acting on another intuitive impulse. Megan raised her hand in a gesture that was neither wave nor greeting, but something more primal, an acknowledgement of shared awareness. The alpha, distinct in its greater size and bearing, raised one massive arm in what appeared to be a mirrored response. Whether this represented understanding, coincidence, or some deeper communication, Megan couldn't determine. What she knew with certainty was that the boundary between her reality and theirs had temporarily dissolved, and she was departing their territory not as an oblivious human, but as a being granted conditional passage and provisional recognition. As she descended the trail leading ultimately back to human civilization, Megan couldn't know that what had transpired on that summit was merely prelude. The beings she had encountered, the Sasquatch family group that had revealed themselves with apparent deliberation, had initiated a connection that would continue to unfold in ways neither she nor they could fully anticipate. The forest shadows deepened around her, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, massive figures moved in parallel to her path, maintaining their vigil until she crossed once more into lands where humans claimed dominion. But something had fundamentally shifted in Megan Collins's understanding of that presumed dominion, a perspective that would be tested severely in the hours to come, as her encounter with these extraordinary beings escalated from observation to direct interaction with stakes higher than she could possibly imagine. As twilight descended over the Cascades, Megan's calculated confidence began to waver. The forest transformed around her, familiar daytime landmarks surrendering to shadow, ordinary sounds amplified by growing darkness. Though she carried a headlamp and had navigated these mountains after sunset before, tonight felt different. The weight of unseen observation pressed against her consciousness, transforming the wilderness from sanctuary to something more ambiguous. I kept reminding myself that if they meant me harm, they'd had ample opportunity, Megan would later recount. But rational thought isn't always accessible when you're alone in growing darkness. Knowing something that shouldn't exist is tracking your every move. The final leg of her planned route traversed a densely wooded valley before climbing to a ridge that would eventually lead back to the trailhead. Under normal circumstances, she would have completed this section before nightfall. The unexpected encounter, however, had disrupted her timing. Now she faced at least 2 hours of night travel through terrain made treacherous by exposed roots, sudden drop-offs, and loose scree. Megan activated her headlamp as the last ambient light faded from the forest. The narrow beam carved a tunnel, of visibility through the darkness, beyond which her imagination populated the shadows with massive, watchful figures. She maintained a sustainable pace, balancing the desire for swift return against the risk of injury that would leave her genuinely vulnerable. The trail descended steadily for nearly an hour, leading Megan deeper into the valley where old-growth conifers blocked even moonlight from reaching the forest floor. The primeval darkness felt almost liquid in its density, her headlamp seemingly swallowed by it rather than penetrating its depths. It was in this profound darkness that the first direct interaction occurred. Megan's headlamp illuminated an obstacle. On the trail ahead, a carefully arranged pile of branches, forming an unmistakable barrier across her path. Though simple in construction, its deliberate placement and organization eliminated any possibility of natural formation. More telling still, the branches had been broken at heights impossible for humans to reach without tools, their fresh breaks oozing sap that glistened in her light beam. "It was like coming across a roadblock in the middle of nowhere," she described. But the message was clear. I wasn't supposed to continue on this particular path. The barricade faced Megan with a crucial decision: attempt to continue on her planned route, potentially against the wishes of beings whose territory she was traversing, or accept the redirection and find an alternative path. Her marathon training had instilled deep respect for listening to intuitive signals, when to push through discomfort and when to adapt plans for safety. Looking around, she noticed a less obvious trail branching eastward. Not the route she had intended, but one that still headed roughly toward her destination. The choice seemed clear. She would respect the boundary established by the forest's inhabitants. In that moment, I stopped thinking of myself as someone with inherent right to go wherever I pleased, Megan explained. I became a visitor, seeking permission rather than assuming access. This mental shift, this surrender of assumed human primacy, would prove crucial to what followed. The alternate path initially seemed promising, slightly overgrown, but navigable as it contoured along the valley's eastern slope, rather than cutting directly through its center. For perhaps half a mile, Megan made steady progress, her senses hyper-attuned to the forest around her. The oppressive feeling of observation had temporarily lifted, as though her decision to respect the barricade had been acknowledged. This reprieve proved short-lived. The trail began to deteriorate, becoming increasingly obscured by undergrowth before disappearing entirely at the edge of a steep ravine. Megan's headlamp revealed a drop of approximately 30 feet to a rock-strewn creek bed below. A dangerous descent under daylight conditions, potentially lethal in darkness. "I felt manipulated," she admitted, "like I'd been deliberately channeled into a dead end." As realization dawned that she'd need to backtrack, a new sound emerged from the darkness behind her. A deep, resonant vocalization unlike anything in her experience. Not quite human speech, yet structured with deliberate modulation, suggesting linguistic intent rather than animal call. It was followed by another, slightly higher-pitched response from somewhere to her right, then a third from the left. With crushing clarity, Megan understood her situation. She had been herded. "They positioned themselves in a semicircle behind me," she recalled, her voice tightening at the memory. "The ravine in front, them behind. I was penned in a three-sided trap of their design." Fear surged through her system, triggering the autonomic cascade of survival response. Elevated heart rate, respiratory acceleration, adrenal flood preparing muscles for desperate exertion. Yet beneath this physiological storm, Megan's analytical mind continued processing, evaluating options with the clarity that had served her through legal battles and ultra-marathon low points alike. Fighting was absurd against beings of such size and strength. Flight required breaking through their formation or attempting a treacherous nighttime descent into the ravine. Neither offered promising survival odds. This left the third primitive option: freeze. Megan switched off her headlamp, plunging herself into the same darkness that concealed her observers. Then, with deliberate calm, she seated herself cross-legged on the forest floor, emptied her lungs fully, and took a deep, meditative breath. The technique, practiced during countless hours of yoga and mindfulness training, didn't eliminate her fear, but created space around it, allowing other faculties to function alongside, rather than being overwhelmed by it. "I thought I was done. Before," she would later confess, "but if these were my final moments, I wanted to meet them with dignity rather than panic." For several minutes, Megan remained motionless in this position, controlling her breathing while her eyes gradually adjusted to the ambient moonlight, filtering through gaps in the canopy. Slowly, shapes resolved in the darkness, massive silhouettes encircling her position at a distance of perhaps 20 yards, their outlines distinguished from surrounding trees by subtle movements as they shifted position. The standoff continued. Intense silence until one figure, taller than the others by at least a foot, approached with deliberate steps that barely disturbed the forest floor despite its enormous weight. Megan's muscles tensed involuntarily, anticipating the worst, yet she maintained her seated position, eyes forward, breath steady. The alpha halted approximately 10 feet from her, close enough that Megan could now discern facial features in the dim light. A pronounced brow ridge, deep-set eyes reflecting starlight, a powerful jaw partially obscured by a beard-like growth of hair. Most striking was the creature's scent, not the rank animal musk she might have expected, but something more complex, earthy, organic, with hints of conifer resin and what seemed oddly like wood smoke. What happened next would transform Megan's understanding not just of these beings, but of humanity's place in the natural order. The alpha lowered itself to a crouching position, bringing its eyes level with hers. From this proximity, intelligence radiated from its gaze with undeniable force, not merely animal awareness, but something that reflected consciousness, intention, and evaluation. Then, with movements of shocking precision, it extended one massive, hand palm upward toward her. Megan's first instinct was to recoil, but intuition overrode fear. With trembling fingers, she reached toward her pack and extracted an energy bar, one of her emergency rations. She slowly placed it in the creature's outstretched palm, the contrast between her slender fingers and its massive digits stark in the moonlight. The alpha didn't immediately consume the offering. Instead, it examined the packaged food with evident curiosity, turning it over to study the wrapper before carefully opening it with dexterity that belied its enormous fingers. Breaking the bar into pieces, it retained the largest portion, but distributed the remainder to the other figures who had now drawn closer, forming an intimate circle around Megan and their leader. It wasn't about hunger, Megan realized later. It was ritual, sharing food as social bonding, establishing reciprocal obligation. The same fundamental practice that appears in every human culture. This exchange seemed to shift the dynamic. Fundamentally, the alpha produced something from a pouch-like fold of hair at its waist, a crystalline object that caught the moonlight, refracting it into momentary spectral flashes. It placed this token in Megan's palm, a clear quartz crystal approximately 3 inches long, one end naturally faceted, the other smoothed, as if from deliberate polishing or prolonged handling. The significance wasn't immediately apparent to Megan, but the ceremonial nature of the exchange was unmistakable. She had been offered something of value, and proper acknowledgement seemed essential. Bowing her head slightly, she secured the crystal in her jacket pocket before reaching into her pack once more. Her fingers found her emergency whistle, a simple metal object designed to signal distress in wilderness emergencies. After a moment's consideration, she removed it from its cord and extended it toward the alpha, maintaining eye contact as she placed it in its enormous palm. The creature examined the whistle with obvious fascination, turning it over repeatedly before bringing it to its face. For a tense moment, Megan feared it might blow the piercing signal, potentially attracting unwanted attention from any humans in the distant vicinity. Instead, it simply traced the object's contours before securing it in the same waist pouch that had held the crystal. This completed exchange appeared to satisfy some unspoken protocol. The alpha rose to its full height, towering over Megan's seated form, and made a sound, partly vocalization, partly exhalation, that somehow conveyed conclusion. The surrounding figures responded with similar sounds, creating a brief chorus of harmonics that Megan felt resonating in her chest cavity. Then, with a gesture that seemed to encompass both Megan and the ravine beyond, the alpha pointed toward the distant ridgeline visible through a gap in the trees, the direction of the trailhead and Megan's parked vehicle. The meaning was unmistakable. Passage granted, but not through the valley. They were directing her to an alternative route. They weren't trapping me, Megan understood with sudden clarity. They were protecting me from something in that valley, something they didn't want me to encounter. Rising to her feet with careful, non-threatening movements, Megan reactivated her headlamp. Rather than disturbing the Sasquatch as she feared, the light seemed to interest them, several tilting their heads with evident curiosity as she adjusted its beam. The alpha gestured once more toward the ridgeline, then stepped aside, creating an opening in their circle. Taking this clear invitation, Megan began moving in the indicated direction. The group fell into formation around her, not as captors, but as escorts. Two moved ahead as vanguard, the alpha walked slightly behind her right shoulder, and the others formed a loose perimeter that maintained a consistent distance while navigating the challenging terrain with ease that Megan could only envy. For nearly 2 hours, this extraordinary procession continued through the moonlit forest. Megan's headlamp illuminated the immediate path, but she found herself increasingly relying on the guidance of her companions, who steered her along game trails and natural passages that no human map identified. They moved with preternatural awareness of the landscape, anticipating obstacles and hazards before they became apparent. It was like having wilderness guides who could read the forest in ways I couldn't imagine, Megan described. They knew exactly where secure footing could be found, which handholds would support weight, when to pause, because loose rocks lay ahead. The route climbed steadily, eventually bringing them to the ridgeline Megan had originally intended to reach. From this vantage point, lights were visible in the far distance, the small ranger station near her trailhead, approximately 3 miles away along an exposed ridge that offered relatively straightforward navigation even in darkness. Here, at the edge of the forest proper, the Sasquatch escort halted. The alpha stepped forward, positioning itself beside Megan rather than behind her. For a lengthy moment, it surveyed the distant lights of human presence, its expression unreadable, yet somehow conveying complexity of thought that transcended simple animal assessment. Then it turned to Megan, meeting her gaze with startling directness. Slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand to its chest, then extended it toward her in a gesture impossible to misinterpret. Acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Megan mirrored the gesture without hesitation, placing her palm against her heart before extending it toward this extraordinary being. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words themselves were meaningless to her companion, but hoping the sentiment might transcend language barriers. The alpha held her gaze for another moment before making a sound, a low melodic vocalization that the others immediately echoed. Then, with fluid coordination that suggested intuitive communication beyond human conception, the group melted into the forest shadows. Within seconds, despite Megan's heightened awareness and the illumination of her headlamp, no trace of their presence remained visible. Alone on the moonlit ridge, the weight of her experience settled fully upon Megan's consciousness. She had been granted something beyond rare, not merely a sighting or encounter, but interaction, exchange, and protection from beings whose existence science refused to acknowledge. The remaining miles to her vehicle passed in a dreamlike state, her body moving automatically while her mind processed the implications of what had transpired. By the time she reached her Subaru, the eastern sky had begun hinting at approaching dawn, the stars fading as night relinquished its hold on the mountains. Seated in her car's familiar comfort, Megan extracted the crystal from her pocket, examining it in the dome light's glow. Beyond its obvious natural beauty, nothing about the object immediately suggested significance. Yet it had been deliberately given, selected for presentation by a being of evident intelligence. This wasn't a random stone, but something of value in a framework she didn't yet comprehend. Starting her car, Megan faced the question that would define her subsequent actions. What does one do after encountering not just a legendary creature, but an entire undocumented intelligent species with evident social structure, communication systems, and cultural practices? The scientific worldview demanded evidence, documentation, peer review, share the crystal for analysis, report the encounter to primatologists, anthropologists, wildlife officials, seek validation and objective verification. Yet a deeper wisdom, one, perhaps awakened by the encounter itself, suggested a different response. These beings had revealed themselves selectively, maintained their hidden existence despite centuries of human expansion, technological development, and scientific inquiry. Their concealment wasn't coincidental but deliberate strategy. They showed themselves to me by choice, not by accident, Megan concluded as she navigated the winding road back toward civilization. That's not a license for exposure. It's a burden of protection. As the sun crested the eastern mountains, illuminating the Cascade Range in golden morning light, Megan made her decision. The crystal would remain with her, undocumented and unanalyzed. Her encounter would go unreported to officials, scientists, or media. She would protect the secret entrusted to her through what appeared to be deliberate selection. This wasn't denial or suppression of truth, she reasoned, but recognition of something indigenous cultures had understood for millennia. Some knowledge isn't meant for dissemination through institutional channels. Some encounters belong to the realm of direct experience rather than empirical analysis. Over the following weeks, Megan found her relationship with wilderness fundamentally transformed. Her regular trail runs continued, but with altered awareness. Each venture into the mountains became not merely recreation or training, but pilgrimage of sorts. She ran with heightened perception, noticing subtleties of the landscape previously filtered from consciousness, patterns of broken branches that might indicate passage of large beings, arrangements of stones too precise for random placement, vocalizations at dawn and dusk that carried linguistic complexity beyond known wildlife. She never again encountered the Sasquatch family group directly, yet evidence of their parallel existence appeared with increasing frequency once she learned to recognize the signs. Twice, she discovered small arrangements of objects on familiar trails, assemblages of feathers, crystalline stones, and bone fragments that seemed placed for her discovery. Whether these represented communication attempts or simply markers of territorial boundaries remained unclear, but their deliberate placement was undeniable. The crystal itself became central to her evolving understanding. Kept on a simple leather cord around her neck, it seemed to generate subtle warmth against her skin when she entered certain areas of the mountains, as if responding to unseen presences or energy fields beyond conventional detection. During particularly vivid dreams, it appeared to emit faint luminescence, though this phenomenon never manifested under controlled observation. 4 months after her encounter, Megan attended an environmental law conference in Vancouver, British Columbia. During a panel discussion on indigenous land rights, she found herself seated beside an elder from a coastal First Nation. As the presentations continued, the elder's gaze repeatedly drifted to the crystal visible at Megan's neckline. When the session concluded, he approached her with gentle directness. "That's a speaker stone," he said without preamble. "May I ask how you came to possess it?" Something in his manner, a wisdom that transcended academic expertise, prompted honesty. "It was given to me," Megan replied carefully, "by someone who lives in the mountains." The elder studied her face with penetrating insight before nodding slightly. "The old ones don't give such gifts without purpose," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been watching us for generations, retreating as our kind forgets how to listen. If they've reached out to you, there's purpose in the connection." Before Megan could respond, the elder continued, "The stone isn't just decoration, it's a tool for listening beyond ordinary hearing. Those who carry such stones sometimes serve as bridges between worlds." With these cryptic words, he pressed something into her palm, a small leather pouch containing dried herbs that released a resinous, earthy scent when opened. "Burn a small pinch when you seek deeper understanding," he instructed, "not to summon or disturb them, but to open perception. Listen with more than your ears." That night in her hotel room, Megan followed the elder's guidance, burning a tiny portion of the herb mixture in an abalone shell borrowed from the hotel's decorative display. As the aromatic smoke filled the small space, she held the crystal between her palms, eyes closed, breathing deeply and rhythmically. What followed transcended conventional description, not hallucination, but expanded perception that dissolved. Boundaries between ordinary consciousness and something more integrated. Images flowed through her awareness, ancient forests untouched by human presence, small family groups of the beings she had encountered moving through landscapes across seasonal cycles. Interactions with indigenous human communities dating back centuries, gradual retreat as European colonization brought violence and exploitation. Most significantly, she perceived the crystal's nature, not merely decorative token, but storage, medium of sorts, containing impressions and knowledge in a format humanity had forgotten how to access. The gift wasn't simply ceremonial but functional, an invitation to learn a method of perception and communication predating human technological development. This revelation transformed Megan's understanding of her encounter. She hadn't simply stumbled upon unknown creatures, but had been deliberate witness to a parallel intelligence, one that had coexisted with humanity throughout our development, while remaining selectively hidden from those whose perceptual frameworks and intentions posed potential threat. In the year following her encounter, Megan made subtle but significant life changes. She reduced her legal practice to part-time, focusing exclusively on environmental protection cases. She moved from her Seattle apartment to a small cabin in the foothills, minimizing her technological footprint while maximizing time spent in direct contact with the natural world. Her ultramarathon participation continued, but with shifted intention, no longer pursuing podium placements, but using the events as opportunities to traverse landscapes with newly awakened perception. She never again experienced direct interaction with the Sasquatch family that had escorted her through the night forest, yet evidence of their continued awareness manifested regularly. Small gifts occasionally appeared near her cabin, uniquely patterned feathers, unusually formed plant galls, once a perfectly spherical stone of unknown mineral composition. She reciprocated with offerings of her own: honey, dried berries, small bundles of herbs, left at the forest boundary with ceremonial respect rather than expectation. The crystal remained her constant companion, its subtle, energetic responses guiding her movement through mountainous terrain. Through continued practice with the elders' methods, She developed capacity to perceive impressions stored within its crystalline matrix, not concrete information, but emotional resonances and awareness states, suggesting the evolutionary history and perceptual framework of the beings who had entrusted it to her. "They've been here far longer than us," she explained to the small circle of trusted friends with whom she eventually shared heavily edited versions of her experience. Not just physically present, but perceiving and understanding in ways we've forgotten or never developed. They don't need our technology because they access information directly through methods we might call psychic or telepathic, but are actually based in natural principles we once understood. Whether her encounter represented isolated incident or the beginning of broader pattern remains unclear. Throughout human history, periods of ecological crisis have occasionally corresponded with increased reports of interaction between humans and beings, typically relegated to folklore, perhaps attempts at communication or warning from intelligences, with deeper temporal perspective than our short-lived species can maintain. What remains certain is that Megan Collins's routine training run through familiar mountains resulted in profound revisioning of her relationship with the natural world and humanity's place within it. The boundary she crossed that April morning wasn't merely between known trails and unexplored wilderness, but between constructed reality and something more fundamental, a perspective recognizing that human dominance is recent, potentially temporary, and based on narrower perception than we typically acknowledge. The Sasquatch family that escorted her through darkness didn't merely spare her life, they offered glimpse into alternative mode of existence, one maintaining continuity with natural systems while developing intelligence along pathways divergent from humanity's technological trajectory. Whether their revelation was exceptional or part of larger pattern of increased interaction during times of ecological transformation remains for future witnesses to discover. As for the crystal that passes from her palm to forest floor during her weekly boundary offerings, then returns to her cabin doorstep by morning, its purpose transcends simple token exchange. It serves as communication medium between parallel intelligences, data storage device predating human technology, and reminder that the forests still harbor mysteries beyond scientific categorization. "I thought I was done for," Megan reflects, when asked about her initial reaction to being surrounded in the night forest. "Instead, I was just beginning, stepping into awareness that what we've forgotten about perception and connection far exceeds what we've gained through technological development." Somewhere in the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest, eyes with depth of intelligence matching or exceeding our own continue watching humanity's unsustainable trajectory. Whether further communication attempts will manifest, and whether our species retains capacity to perceive and interpret such outreach, may determine not just understanding of these extraordinary beings, but our own continued existence as planetary crisis accelerates. For Megan Collins, former ultra-runner and reluctant ambassador between worlds, the path forward is clear, if challenging. Continue developing perceptual frameworks that transcend technological mediation, protect the secret knowledge entrusted to her care, and perhaps, most importantly, listen with more than ears to messages carried through crystal dream and forest silence from intelligences whose evolutionary wisdom might offer guidance through humanity's most perilous transitional period. The boundary between worlds remains permeable for those with courage to cross and wisdom to respect what waits beyond human dominion, beings not of legend but of flesh, intelligence and purpose, watching from forest shadows as humanity decides whether to remember its place within rather than above the natural systems that preceded our brief evolutionary moment and will certainly outlast our species should we continue prioritizing expansion over integration. They're still out there, Megan concludes with quiet certainty. Not just surviving, but observing, evaluating whether humanity remembers how to listen before our developmental trajectory renders such communication impossible. The invitation remains open, carried in stones and dreams and moments of unexpected perception, not just to witness their existence, but to remember our own original nature. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe,